Alrighty, well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. There's a lot to cover today because this is our last class. And so I want to use this to talk about chapter 45 of Genesis. But I'd also like to kind of tie up Genesis as a whole to reflect back on these larger strands or themes that we've talked about throughout the summer. But before we kind of dig into all of that, I want to say a big thank you to Sarah for covering last week. I heard great things again. So it was awesome to have Sarah let me get away for a Sunday. I've been teaching Sunday school since February nonstop, and so it was nice to take a little break this summer. And I deeply appreciate Sarah being a colleague and helping out. Another note is next week. Next week, we start a new class, and it'll be covering this. This isn't working. This is what happens when you have one of these stupid backgrounds that I have. Hold on one second. I am going to, I say stupid, I actually like them. All right. Oh, all right. None. Okay. Can y'all see this? So this is the book we'll be reading. It's called I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austin Channing Brown. Some of you might be familiar with this. The youth actually read it this summer. And so it's a book that our church has gone through with Kenny. I don't know if I think he just did the high school. I'm not sure. But I haven't read it yet. I'm excited to read it. I've heard from lots of good friends that it's great. I've also heard that Austin Channing Brown's an amazing speaker. I've actually had some friends that have seen her speak in person, pre-quarantine, obviously. But she speaks about the Black experience in America, specifically as a Christian, and specifically someone that has largely been in and out of white churches. So it's going to be a 2-week discussion that will start next week. Kim Toole is going to lead it, and I don't see her on here, so I'll just kind of speak for the class. Faye, you're muted.
I am co-leading it, not co-leading it, but helping her.
Oh,
I
great!
have read it, so I really want to plug it.
You
It's
go on vacation,
terrific.
and the world changes. So go ahead.
And yeah, so we're going to tag team. She's going to be the lead because she's got a reputation that as a solid teacher. So I really, really want to plug it and recommend it. Also keep in mind that we're going to start up later in a couple of weeks with a Thursday night series. Kim's leading it again with video around social justice. But as Will was mentioning, the thing I like
That's a
about
movie group.
it's a movie group. This particular book, as he mentioned, Kenny taught, strikes me because it is a African American woman in the church and how she has felt that we, the white people, have treated her consciously or unconsciously. And I love it. So she's great. She's smart. It's an easy read. See you next week.
Thanks, Faye, and thanks for co-leading. You can get the book at Amazon and other booksellers. It's available on Kindle, and it's also available as an audiobook through the library. And I think John Wells said it's downloadable too. Anyhow, that'll be happening the next 2 weeks. Then we'll take Sunday off for Labor Day, and 2 new classes will start after that. One will be a group for folks that are experiencing grief or loneliness, isolation, whatever it is you're experiencing in this time, and you're seeking out a community amid it. Sally Spear will be leading an intimate, aka a small group, for 6 weeks. That's just discussion-based, conversation-based, and a kind of a support group. Sally Spear is a licensed, she's a retired licensed social worker, and she'll be leading that group. Chuck Jones will also be leading a class, and that will be called Religion and the Presidency. And he's going to look at 22 presidents and their faith and talk about how their faith has impacted, their belief structure has impacted the presidency, their role as president, and kind of overseeing how that affected the country as a whole throughout their terms. Chuck is a professor and has taught on this subject before. So this is something he knows very deeply and intimately. So that should be a neat class, and that'll be 6 weeks. You'll get information on this. We'll send it out, but that's starting after Labor Day. Okay, back to Genesis. All right, so we've left last week with chapter 37 and the story of Joseph being sold off into slavery by his brothers. Some stuff has happened in between, and so I want to cover that because it's very important for where we come to today in chapter 45. Excuse me. So briefly, Joseph is sold into slavery. He works for a man named Potiphar, who is an officer of the Pharaoh, and he does great work for him, and things are going well. And then Potiphar's wife comes on to him. Joseph kind of pushes her away, and so she grabs one of his garments and says, Joseph came on to me, and he tried to take advantage of me or whatever. And so Joseph is thrown into jail. So Joseph goes from slavery kind of upward. Though he's still in slavery, he's got a good cush position and things are going well. He has a lot of responsibility. And then he goes back down and he's in jail. And so he's in jail for a while. And while he's in jail, two of the Pharaoh's servants, a cupbearer and a baker, come there. And they're the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And they have these strange dreams that are somewhat similar. And no one can interpret them. And so Joseph interprets them. I want you to remember that throughout the Joseph story, God is never mentioned as a character except through one of the characters speaking about God. So the story never says God did this, God did that. It's always Joseph saying, well, God can interpret these dreams. Or what you intended for ill, God intended for good. And so that's me making a distinction between a text saying God's kind of pulling the strings behind everything, and a text saying the agents, the characters in the text, are interpreting where God is in the world. And that's an important distinction. And I think it has kind of ramifications for how we read these texts. We'll get into that later, but that's an important note. So basically, Joseph says he can interpret it through God, or God will help him. And he interprets them, and what he interprets comes true. The cupbearer is released from prison and goes back to the Pharaoh, and the baker is killed. And he tells the cupbearer, hey, tell the Pharaoh about me because it's terrible in here and I want to get out of jail. And the cupbearer's like, oh, okay, I got you, man, thanks. And then the cupbearer forgets, and he forgets for 2 whole years. And then one day the Pharaoh has these 2 dreams, and they're very familiar dreams. One of them, there's a fat cow. There's 7 fat cows, and they're lustrous and sheen. And then 7 skinny cows come, and they eat those cows. And they can't find anyone that can interpret it correctly. And so the cupbearer all of a sudden remembers Joseph. Joseph's brought out of prison. He interprets the dreams, and he says, this basically means that you're going to have 7 years of great crops. There's going to be lots of grain. Things are going to go well. The rain's going to come. And then you're going to have 7 years of drought, and there's going to be no crops at all. And so the Pharaoh sees that Joseph is in touch with God and can interpret dreams correctly. And so he sets him over the land essentially as a number 2 in command. He's basically the governor under Pharaoh. And so things are going great. And then for 7 years, and Joseph is accruing grain throughout this to prepare. And then the story that we know so well, Jacob sends his sons during the drought to Egypt because he says, I've heard Egypt has lots of grain and we need to go get some because we're dying over here. And so they go, and who do they come in front of? Their long lost brother Joseph that they sold into slavery. And the story is worth reading again if you haven't. I think there's so much emotion. There's also the kind of revenge that we as readers are hoping for, and the kind of upsetting of that expectation or that desire over and over again. But Joseph sees his brothers, and he kind of almost is like his dad, right? He's kind of deceitful and mischievous with them. So they come and he says, well, you need to come back with your youngest brother. Because remember, all of them are half brothers except Benjamin. And Benjamin's his full brother. And Benjamin doesn't come with him because Benjamin has kind of taken his place as Jacob's favorite. So Joseph says, come back with Benjamin. And he puts a bunch of money, basically the money they had bought the grain with, back in their bags. So he's playing all these tricks with them. He accuses them of being spies. He keeps Simeon, I believe, is the brother that he keeps. And so they go home, they tell Jacob, and Jacob's freaking out because he doesn't want to lose Benjamin, right? He's already lost his son Joseph, who he thinks is dead. He doesn't know he's been sold into slavery, right? They gave him the multicolored robe, the Technicolor dream coat, the robe with long sleeves, however you want to talk about it. They gave that, and it was shredded, and they had put animal blood on it. And so Jacob is just, you can imagine, rife with anxiety over this. But they send Benjamin, and they send him, and he goes, and they have this big feast, and then Joseph has one of his servants put a silver cup in Benjamin's bag. And that basically is how he says, Benjamin, you've stolen this from me. And so he says, I'm going to hold on to Benjamin, and you go and get your dad and bring him back. And right at that point, Judah just can't take it anymore. And Judah pleads for Benjamin. And he says, if you do this, my dad won't make it down here. He'll die. He'll die from grief because he almost died from losing one brother. And now he's going to die from another. So that's all that's happened in just a few short chapters when we get into this. I want to think about a couple of things before we read our text. And that is this reversal that's happening. The reversal, there was all these kind of commonalities in the Jacob story. These words that were similar, birthright, blessing, there was all these kind of things like that interwove that story. And I see the Joseph story as this kind of reversal of fortune story, this reversal of happening story. And it's also a story of providence. And it's not providence in the way where just God is an agent, but there are multiple agents and there are multiple happenings. And I want you to think about providence as we read the story today, and how you think of providence and how it's playing out in this story. So let us come to the text. I hear sighs of relief, finally. So I want to break the text up into 3. Well, it's kind of hard to do that. Let's just do it into 2. Kelly McCord, would you read verses 1 through 15? And Aaron, if you'll read 16 through 28, or just finish the chapter. And Kelly, you can start. It looks like everyone's ready, so you can start now. Thanks.
Okay. Can you hear? Am I doing that? Yep. Okay. Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. 45. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all of those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when his brothers made himself known. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold to Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life for the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to reserve you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house, and ruler over the land of Egypt. Hurry and go to my father and say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt, and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck, and he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him.
When the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brothers had come, Pharaoh and all his officials were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, Tell your brothers, do this. Load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land. You are also directed to tell them, Do this. Take some carts from Egypt for your children and your wives, and get your father and come. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all Egypt will be yours. So the sons of Israel did this. Joseph gave them carts, as Pharaoh had commanded, and he also gave them provisions for their journey. To each of them he gave new clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes. And this is what he sent to his father: 10 donkeys loaded with the best of things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and other provisions for his journey. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they were leaving, he said to them, Don't quarrel on the way. So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father, Jacob, in the land of Canaan. They told him, Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler of all Egypt. Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of the father Jacob revived. And Israel said, I'm convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die.
Thank y'all. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So this is a happy story. I think in many ways it kind of upends expectations, even the expectations of the brothers. And I just want to point out a couple of quick things. When Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, verse 2, it says he weeps loudly. And throughout the story, he's had to contain his weeping twice because he sees his brother Benjamin, or he notices it's his brothers. And he becomes overwhelmed with emotion, and it's an emotion of joy. It's an exhilarative feature, right? It's not an anger. It's not a vengefulness. It's one of joy. And there's a part, I think it's when he sees Benjamin earlier for the first time. He literally has to go walk into another room. It's while they're having the feast, and it says he cleans his face up and he comes back in. And so you can imagine the emotion that the text is trying to get through here. And so this third time, he finally can fully weep, and he weeps so loud the whole house of Pharaoh hears him. So this is a very, very joyful moment, and there's a lot of pathos in it. And there's this kind of confusion on the parts of the brothers, right? In verse 3 and 4, it says they're dismayed, and Joseph has to kind of reintroduce himself because they're in shock. They don't know what to do. And it doesn't say it now, but you can imagine there is this expectation that they think, oh, great, this guy's literally second in command over the entire country or empire of Egypt. He's going to kill us. And they still think that because when their brother dies, when their father Jacob dies later, which I think is chapter 49, they literally make up a lie and say, hey, Dad said before he died that you have to forgive us for selling you into slavery because he doesn't want you to he doesn't want you to be upset with us anymore. He wants us to be whole. And so that fear even amidst the graciousness of Joseph, is still there, right? And I think that's an interesting thing to think through in this story, and thinking through forgiveness, but also forgiveness on the part of people that have committed the act, right? That have been sinful. Because Joseph, in his largeness of heart, his forgiveness, is able to move on and to welcome them back into the fold. And they still haven't fully come into the fold, right? They have one foot in, they're still scared. In fact, they're scared after all of this. So Joseph invites his brothers back, and then he reassures them in verse 5. And verse 5 through 8, I would say, are one of the most important parts of this entire chapter. So starting with verse 5. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. I would say, theologically speaking, this is an extremely complex exposition of providence. It's not the kind of childish puppet master God sitting over and doing all these things. He starts saying, you brought me here by selling me into slavery. And then he ends by saying, God brought me here, right? He's saying 2 things, if you notice. But what he's saying is that history happens parallel to the work of God. It's not one or the other, right? There's not this cleanliness. It's messy. And God's work is amidst the work of history. And so the brothers' intentions were counter to God's intentions. And yet the brothers brought him to Egypt. And yet he says, God brought me to Egypt. And so I want you to think about the complexity of that. It's not simple. There's a lot of theological work happening here. And the way I would say is that singular events, Joseph going to Egypt, have double agency. There's the agency of the brothers who are selling him into slavery, which we could say is a sinful act. And there's the work of God that is seeing into the future and trying to care for the covenantal promise generations past Joseph. And so God is working through these kind of misdeeds of humanity. And so it's not providence is happening and history doesn't happen, and it's not history is happening and providence isn't happening. It's both and that's a complex way to think through it. We can talk more about that, but I think this is one of the most beautiful parts of this chapter and the Joseph story as a whole. So basically, he's saying God has preserved my life, God has preserved the life of my family, and God has preserved the life of Israel as a nation or as a people. And so there's this kind of 3-tiered work going on as well. And that's another thing about Joseph. Joseph's story, his mindset, his frame of reference is always outside of himself. I mean, even when his brothers come, he's moving towards forgiveness and not just thinking about how life was for him. Remember, he was sold into prison as a as a young boy, into slavery, went to prison, and is in a foreign land, disconnected from all family. So his life hasn't been easy in many ways, and yet he's constantly thinking outside of himself. And his frame of reference even extends beyond blood relationships to this larger idea of God is at work to carry out us as a people. And we remember the story, right? The story of Israel goes through Egypt, right? That's the next book, Exodus. The things change, right? The next Pharaoh forgets who Joseph was, and things go bad for Israel, but it's still part of the story. So anyhow, there's this moment in 14 through 15 that's very reminiscent of when Jacob sees Esau, and there's a kind of the tension of, is this going to be a fight? Is there going to be anger? And yet Esau is forgiving and welcomes Jacob, and they hug each other and they weep. And so that happens with first with Benjamin and then with the rest of the brothers. And Oh, I skipped over verse 9, which is important. Verse 9 says, listen to the language here. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, take your son Joseph. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not delay. So there's this language of up and down, not go back, not come to, but up and down. And if you remember when Joseph was lost, Jacob thought he died, and he says, well, that's it for me. I'm just going to go down to Sheol, right? Because he said his grief was going to be so bad, he was just going to die. And he said, if Benjamin got lost, I would go down to Sheol for sure. I would die. And so there's a reversal here, and it's linguistic, right? It's pointing out this language of up and down. So Jacob is going to come down, but instead of coming down to Sheol and his death, he's going to come down to Egypt and life. He's going to come down into abundance that his son has prepared for him. That's a beautiful reiteration of this theme of Genesis, right? That God brings life out of loss, that God brings life where there was death. And so the brothers, they're told to come. There's so much here. You should just move here because I can take care of you. And there's plenty. Go get your wives, go get dad, and come back here. And then the Pharaoh hears about it. And the Pharaoh, who obviously admires Joseph, kind of says, anything you want, it's yours. So the sons of Israel did so, right? They do this. They go tell their dad, and they come. And then the last thing I want to just point out is verse 28. It says, Israel said, enough, my son Joseph is still alive. I must go and see him before I die. And that word enough, I've seen the Hebrew translated as abundant, because when we hear enough, it's almost like, oh, enough, right? But this is enough in the sense of plentifulness. And so you could think of it being translated like this. Israel said, it is abundant. My son Joseph is still alive. I must go see him before I die. And I think that gives more of this sense of joy, the abundance, both spiritually and materially, right? Because they're living in a drought right now. Things aren't going well for them. And all of a sudden it's like their wealth, their food has been, quadrupled. So there's a lot of joy in this. There's a reunion in this. There's also reversal in this. Joseph is now the one in power, and the reversal of Joseph, instead of using that for punishment or for revenge, doesn't happen. And so there's a reversal of how Joseph responds in a position of power versus his brothers. There's also a reversal of the fortune of the families. They are in a place of drought, and now they are in a place of wealth, both materially and food-wise. I think reversal is very much the story of Joseph in a way. A couple quick questions that I have. What does this teach us about forgiveness? I think one of the biggest lessons is, why can't the brothers, Joseph forgives. I think the part for us to think about is, much like the prodigal son's older brother, why can't we participate in that forgiveness? Why do we have to stand outside of the house as the party goes on? Remember, the father forgives the son, welcomes him into the house, and the older brother's like, this isn't right, this isn't fair, I'm going to stand outside the house while there's a party going on, right? And so this doesn't compare exactly, but I do think there is this question of what goes on with that guilt that the brothers felt, that didn't allow them, or whatever they're feeling, that doesn't allow them to fully enjoy the forgiveness that their brother has offered them. And also, just, can we forgive as Joseph forgives? Because that's not easy. Providence, this double agency I spoke of. How is this challenging our sense of providence, whether we don't have a sense of providence or whether we do have a sense of providence? How is this text challenging us on that? How is this text speaking about the work of God within the world? That's something I'm just really interested in. And there's not a hair splitting here, right? He's not saying, well, God did this, and you did that, and then God did this, and you did that, and God did this. It's much more this overarching, you were at work and God was at work. Another thing to point out is that providence entails our engagement. Providence isn't saying that God works and we sit back and let God do everything. It's saying that we participate in it, right? Joseph still had to interpret dreams. He still had to put himself out there. Remember, he said, hey, don't forget me when you go, because I want to get out of jail. He didn't just sit there and say, well, God's going to let me out of jail. Oh, I'm not going to interpret those dreams. God will get me out of here somehow, right? It entails that we participate in it. There's this language a lot of theologians use as co-creators. God invites us, calls us to participate in the act of creation. And so in a providential way, we are being called to participate in that providence, that work of God in the world. And then lastly is covenant. And I think this kind of is a good question to end with for the entire book, is how have we seen loss and death in these stories, and how has God countered death and loss, barrenness over and over again, so that the covenant promise can continue, that it can go on. It's constantly threatened. There's messiness throughout. There are broken figures through which it is carried out. And yet God, through this long history, right, these are multiple generations, carries out the covenantal promise. There's doubt, there's faith, there's righteousness, there's sinfulness. Throughout all of this, covenant continues. Before I open it up, I want, if you have your Bible in front of you, to turn to chapter 50 of Genesis and look at verse 20. This is probably the most famous verse in all of the Joseph story. What's also called the Joseph novella, because it's very long, but it's probably one of the most famous from the entirety of Genesis. And this is Joseph speaking. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. That's just such a rich verse. There's so much story in it. There's so much theology in it. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. This isn't a God of the past. It is a God that still acts. It is a God that acts amid history. It is a God that sometimes acts in spite of history. It is a God that is deeply involved, deeply compassionate, and deeply caring of God's people. So, what questions, thoughts, reflections do you have on this story or on Genesis as a whole?
Well,
yes, Dave.
in this story, it strikes me if we could possibly hope that the slaves of America could have this reversal, that God's idea is to raise them up to the level of Joseph and have power and wisdom and correct place in America, such that they can look back to Africa. This is a bit condescending sounding, but they can look back to Africa and save their brothers that were left there. I mean, you see this with AIDS, you see it with Ebola, you see it with help with the genocide that goes on over there and so on and so forth. And we obviously have a huge way to go to bring the slaves of America up to a level that is that powerful, but perhaps we are on our way there.
Yeah, that's a big question and a lot of complexity to it. And I'm not going to even attempt to answer that in any way that would be, addressing it fully. I think to think through that, I would lift up the Exodus story, and the African American community has lifted that story more so than the Joseph story, as the one through which they interpret their struggles. And to address your other questions, yeah, I don't, it's hard to see the Joseph story paralleling it completely because it's his family that sells him into slavery and not some just random, imperial colonialists that come and do it. And I think that's why the Exodus story is a much better framework for that, right? Because Pharaoh kind of entails an empire that's not related, that takes over Hebrews and makes them into slaves. So I think that's historically why the Exodus story has been interpreted by the African-American community. Thanks. I see Bill Hull.
A couple of things quickly. First of all, I'm unmuted. Based on what you just said, sadly, a part of the story of slavery is that Africans did sell Africans into slavery. Now, again, this is a deep subject and we can move on, but that's a sad part of the story. On the issue of forgiveness, in my career as a minister, I never really liked my sermon titles. One that I used more than once when I preached on forgiveness was forgiveness is a journey, meaning that it doesn't happen in an instant. I think that's a magical view that, we're commanded to forgive. No question about that. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. But it is a journey, and I think this is clearly that. In my mind, it's possible to understand Joseph's rather harsh behavior toward his brothers as his dealing with his own sense of revenge. And maybe part of his journey was finally coming to the point where you just pointed out, he comes to understand that God was somehow working through it. But I don't think he arrived there magically. Another part of it is, you've noted the brothers continue to engage in deception, and Joseph continues to play favorites. He gives Benjamin much more than the others. Part of what we read gives him more clothing and money, so that forgiveness does not mean I'm magically transformed into this all nice person. I am still a sinful human being. I found it pastorally helpful to stress to people that forgiveness is a journey. And one quick illustration, and I'll end. I had a colleague once that I had helped who at one point tried to ruin my reputation. And when that memory comes up, I still have a flashback to the hurt and anger that I went through. And I choose again to forgive. In the New Testament, there's more than one Greek word that we translate forgive. My favorite is the one that literally means to open your fist and release something. That for me is a helpful image. What was done was wrong, but I can release myself from the bondage of revenge or anger or whatever.
Thanks. That's helpful, and I think that point's important one to make about this isn't something that happens overnight, and it takes work because it's not easy to forgive. And we have to, remember this story's told in a condensed way, right? And the life of Joseph in Egypt was a longer one than the text makes out as far as just how we're reading through it so quickly. And so you can imagine the work that he's doing there as well. It also reminded me when you said something about the garments, that's another reversal, right? He gives his brothers new garments and they took his long robe from him. And what did they do with it? They ripped it and they turned it into blood. And so again, there's this reversal that Joseph is not taking the sinful, revengeful, the angry act, but rather giving new, clean garments. And one commentator pointed out that the garments are not only new and clean, they're an indication of an ascent in a societal way, right? They're ascending from a shepherd people that live in Canaan to almost being in the highest high of the royal court. Thanks, Bill. Who else has a question, thought, reflection?
Go ahead, Dennis.
What was-
You're muted, Dennis.
I, I'm usually using my computer and I just couldn't find the unmute. I'm up in Raleigh. Something that is always perplexing to me is how much control God has and influence our lives. Take the Joseph story. I believe God meant for Joseph to end up, he could have been made to end up in Canaan and set up granaries there, but it was probably meant for him to end up down in Egypt. But how much influence does God have in our decisions? I don't think God's going to influence the brothers to sin, but God may have encouraged them that to take advantage of the caravan coming along. Will, you mentioned two situations. You have our lives and the way we live it and God's intentions, and he sort of combines both of them and to achieve God's goals. So, you know, this is perplexing to me. Sometimes I think, well, maybe God influenced the brothers to do what they did so that Joseph would end up in Egypt. But and you mentioned there's two realms going on, the individuals who are making the decisions and God's plan. But God took the situation as it was and made it to fulfill his plan. You understand what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do. And I think that's something people have wrestled with since the beginning of time, right? I think the way I would answer that is the text doesn't seek to answer that question. It doesn't even address it, right? It doesn't say, well, God caused y'all to get jealous of me. And then God caused y'all to sell, right? It just says, y'all sent me here to Egypt. And then he reinterprets it and says, God sent me here to Egypt. And so the way I would answer that, and thinking through this theologically in our own lives, I think we can get caught up in the granular details of trying to discern, is God doing this? Is God doing that? And I think what God calls us to do is to align ourselves with God, to do as best we can to live a life that God is calling us to do. And what is that? Well, that entails wrestling, reading scripture, praying, talking in community, being corrected by others, right? Because oftentimes we're completely wrong. And that kind of work isn't this like God doing this, God doing that, but it's rather us trying more and more to align ourselves with God's will. And so I think the story is showing us the brothers were going against what God intended, right? They hated their brother. They sold their brother off into slavery. They lied to their father. I think we can pretty clearly say God didn't intend any of those things. What God intends is not specific things, but rather life. God intends life and God intends relationship. And so in the person of Joseph, we see life continued because of the grain and the ability to care for family. And we see relationship continued. And this is important, right? Because he could have easily said, I don't want anything to do with y'all. You know, here's some grain, but go back. I don't want to have anything else to do with you. And instead, he welcomes them back in and he forgives them. And so in that sense, life is continued on a kind of survival level, but life on a much broader loving level is continued as well because of the continuity of relationship through the big-heartedness of Joseph. And so I think that's providence at work, not in specific actions, but rather the intentionality of people. So like Dennis, in your own life, God's not trying to get you to do one thing or another as much as God wants you to love your neighbor, to love yourself, to love your family. That's how I see it. I'm happy for you to disagree with me though.
Well, I was speaking in generalities. Wasn't trying to be specific, but I don't think God does influence individuals to sin to fulfill God's plan. But in general, I think that he does intervene in situations where he feels it's going to be advantage to is fulfilling his plan.
Yeah. And I think I think you bring up a good point too, is this idea that like God isn't causing people to sin, but I think God can work in spite of sinfulness. And we see that in our own lives on very small scales and on very large scales. Thanks, Dennis. And thanks for joining us. Marcia?
Two things. I've been looking for an advantage to being older and creakier, but one of the advantages is, to me, when you're going through some of these things, you're thinking sometimes, what is God doing here? But when you've got a lot longer path in the rearview mirror, it is easy to see that God was at work in my life through these things and in these things, even though at the time it kind of seemed kind of miserable. The other thing that I pull out of this story is I see Joseph a little bit as a prefigure of Christ, of Jesus in some ways, and certainly in his forgiveness. And I see me and the brothers sometimes going back and re-asking for forgiveness for things that, and having a difficult time to really just accept, he's forgiven me. That's done. And so even later in the story, we see the brothers still wondering whether they could be forgiven when indeed they were.
Yeah, that's a great point, and such an important one. I think the your hindsight point is so good, because I that's a great way to talk about providence, is in hindsight, instead of trying to see it in the moment or into the future, right? Because we have the clarity in hindsight that we don't always have in the moment or in the future, or we never have any in the future unless we've got some psychics among us. Thanks, Marcia. And I think your point with Jesus is great. And I also would bring up the theme of resurrection, right? Because there are these kind of material resurrections happening throughout Genesis. The life despite barrenness, the life despite loss, the life in spite of death. And it's not a resurrection in the sense of bodily resurrection, but I think it kind of is a presaging or a kind of intimation of what resurrection is. Thanks. And I saw Kelly had, I'll read her comment. I didn't realize that Joseph said in verse 24, do not quarrel along the way. And that makes me giggle thinking of families on road trips. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of families have said don't quarrel along the way this summer. Yeah, and that's kind of funny too, just for Joseph. In spite of the years he's had apart from his brothers, he still remembers their brothers. Thanks. Who else has questions or thoughts? Yep.
I will have a comment if I may.
Yeah, and Joette, I saw you, so I'll get to y'all next. Go ahead, Martin.
Okay, the one thing that I see, Joseph, the thing that you had mentioned at the first is we all expected a revenge motif to happen from this thing. And one of the things that I believe and I noticed is the way that Joseph forgave his brothers. The first thing he has to do is quit being a victim. If you're a victim, you can't do the forgiveness. And so, he didn't dwell on, well, they threw me in a hole, they sold me into slavery, blah, 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 blah. He erased all that. And then he had the capability to forgive him for what they did. So it's a pretty interesting little thing that you have to do. I think it applies to a lot of things, actually. I don't know what some other people will think, but I'd be interested in the comments that they would have.
Thanks. I'll let others respond as they'd like. I think Bill's point here is important again, that this didn't happen overnight. It took years and years of work. And I think too, I hear what you're saying, and I don't want to diminish that, but I also want to lift up that it's important that it's okay to grieve. It's okay to be mad at times and upset, and that forgiveness is a goal, but it's not an overnight one. If no one, well, I'll let Sarah respond, and then Joette will come to you.
I thought it was interesting that Joseph named his son Manasseh. and that means to forget.
Mhm.
And he even says it helps him to forget the striving or the pain that his family has caused him. And he has forgotten how hurtful and how distant that pain is, which is an interesting dynamic, in that oftentimes when you become a parent, your perspective changes and you just don't even notice it. And he acknowledges that with his son's name, that he's been able to separate from what was done to him into who he's become.
Yeah, and the second born is Ephraim, right? To be
Yeah.
fruitful. Thanks. Joette?
So mine's a little bit of an observation and a question, and that is when the brothers come back and they tell Jacob that Joseph is alive. We don't really get a sense of the response other than they say that they tell him exactly what Joseph has told him. We don't hear that they've admitted to the father that they were responsible for him being in Egypt in the first place. Is this another, maybe another illustration of forgiveness, that Jacob is forgiving the brothers, or is it just that he is now accepting of this, of Joseph's providence, that he believes that he was sent there for a purpose?
So as far as I know, Jacob never knows about the slavery story. He thinks that it was, he was murdered by an animal. Because that's what, I guess, what it's like in the 40th chapter. It's in one of the chapters after last week's that when they go in, or is it in 37? There's so much that happens in this story. Yeah, it's in 37. He says, verse 33, he recognized the long robe and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." So that's kind of where he is. So the text doesn't really explain, and granted, I haven't read forward except chapter 50 and pecked around, but I'm pretty sure, someone correct me if I'm wrong, that he never realizes that his sons did what they did. So and to answer your other question, he can't forgive them if he doesn't know, right?
Now,
Yes, Sarah.
in 45, chapter 45, verse 26, Jacob is stunned and he did not believe them. And in 27, he goes, "But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts that Joseph had sent, the spirit of their father Jacob was revived." So there's a bit of a hint there that they may have disclosed everything, but I don't know that there's enough information that we can assume that's entirely true.
Yeah, that's one of those things that we don't know, right? They could have told him literally everything, or they could have just told him that, hey, Joseph's in Egypt and he's doing really well, everything. Yeah, I don't know. I know, I'm almost fairly certain that the text never says explicitly that they tell him. So that's another interesting part of the Genesis story, is what's left out, and for us to consider, are these things intentional or are they unintentional? Because I think we always want everything to be neatly packaged up and everyone to, speaking for these sons of Israel, to be Boy Scouts, right? Well, they made a bad mistake, but they're good people now. And the reality is they lied to Joseph right after their dad dies, right? And so they're not Boy Scouts by any means. And I'm not saying that to solely the Bible, but rather for us to come to the reality that no one's perfect, and we're not. And so there's this just constant flux of bad behavior and good behavior throughout. And I think the work is trying to push more and more towards the good behavior. we've got a couple minutes left. Does anyone have any overall thoughts on Genesis, or just reflections after reading Genesis, after, you know, maybe it's been a couple years or a while since you've read it all the way through, or thoughts on some of the themes like covenant or responsibility? Nothing? Oh, I saw Faye first and then Pam.
I have a million things to say. That's why I've been quiet. I really was struck by your both and intellectually and spiritually, that has worked for me as I've matured. That so situation, you know. So here's Joseph. He is kind of obnoxious, and his dad fuels it by picking a favorite. And we discussed this through the class. That's not a good parental decision. And then we watch Joseph change from being this arrogant braggart to a very, very kind and forgiving man. But the question of, you know, when Joseph said, God brought me here, God did this. And I think some of us journey when horrible things have happened to us and people say, well, God had a purpose for that. Remember that kind of horrible, stingy, horrible stuff? But I like the notion that it is a both and, like you said. You know, yes, God used that purpose out of this condition, but God didn't make that horrible thing happen to you, particularly just because you need to shape in that way. And then the notion of forgiveness, I think you also brought up earlier. Some people, even though you've forgiven them, they won't accept that. And that's an interesting journey. You know, personally, my husband was an unfaithful person. And so then when he'd get caught or to be apologetic, he'd say to me, well, you're not really a Christian because you haven't fully forgiven me. And so it was an interesting game. So then I said, I actually do forgive you. And I took a time, but got there, right? But then he will still continue to bring up, you never really forgave me. So it's been an interesting dance because I actually have. But it's like he needed to hang on to that for some reason. And so some people just still have to carry their rocks with them or the whip with them for their own psychological, so, you know, so that's all I want to say about that. I have 1,000 other things, but we should do that some other day.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, that point about forgiveness and for sharing your story. That's there's so much in that, and I appreciate you sharing. I think one of the things that I keep thinking about is like, if you want to get caught up in the bickering, and like as you put it, he had rocks to keep holding. You can, but I don't think that's what God intends for us or God wants for us. And it's hard work to forgive. I don't want to diminish what you've done. But I do think that there's a peace that comes with that doesn't come with, as you put it, holding onto the rocks. And then to your first point, I think just to give a personal example, when I first got sick and when I was in and out of the hospital, people would tell me that this was God's will. And I won't tell you what I wanted to tell them because it contains a lot of 4-letter words. And yet I can, in my life, say that God is at work. And I think the way I've theologically thought through that is that God is working in spite of these things, right? So it's not that God caused Joseph to go into Egypt, into slavery, but in spite of Joseph being in Egypt and in slavery, God works in Joseph's life. And I think that's that both and, because there is a temptation to say, I got sick, or whatever bad happened to you, and God doesn't care about me, and screw God, and I'm done with all of this. And I've been there, so I'm not going to act like that's not something I've thought. But that is a life of anger and despair, and it's holding on to the rocks, as Faye put it. And it takes a lot of work, but I've gotten to a place where I can say, no. God has been present throughout, and God is at work in spite of this illness, and God is bringing life in spite of the kind of constant shadow of death that I've experienced through being sick and through dialysis. And I think there's a maturity that requires, because it's easier to say God did this or God didn't do that, and to say and to instead say, no, there are two things happening at once here, and God might be acting in spite of or against something. Thanks, Faye. Anyone else? Pam, did you have something to say? You're still muted. Oh, there you go.
I just wanted to say the idea of reversal is just so important, and the idea of Jacob reversing when our family relations heal or when we open the dialogue, it's like a whole new lease on life. And the idea, you had a wonderful question and I didn't get it down. How is God at work? Or was that your fourth question? But I kept thinking of reversal, and I kept thinking about what the gentleman said about Africa. And I was thinking, don't use the word slave, but use the word people that are, we had a really good discussion with Sarah, that are maybe don't have some of the benefits they should have. And I think we need to recognize that we need a reversal. And rather than worry about, I know it would be nice to think about how to help Africa and all the things, but we need the reversal right in this country to have a stronger country. And it's the idea, is this idea of God working through the chance of making things better. Is just a wonderful thought.
Thanks. Yeah, the God working in spite of our shortcomings and our evil and our awfulness, and God working through us as a whole. But I think that's just as important, because there's also the sensation, well, I've messed up, I can't do anything now. And that's not what God wants from us either. God wants us to get back out there and fix things. Well, I'm going to leave it at that, because I could talk, and I'm sure some of y'all could too, on and on about Genesis. I want to give a big thank you for following along and for engaging in this text and asking these questions. I taught Genesis 3 years ago, and it was like teaching it all anew with y'all. I saw more, I thought more questions. I love the way that y'all thought about the text in the context of your own lives and in what's going on in society. And so I just want to say a big thanks. I'll use this email for 2 more weeks through Kim's class. So I'll send out stuff, Kim and Faye's class, and send out information and the link for that. I'll give you a Zoom for it. We'll probably just use a new Zoom. Aaron just asked me about that, but I'll send all of that out to you, and a reminder email next Sunday. Thank y'all so much, and let's quickly close with our benediction. Let us go from this place remembering God's words to Jacob. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Let us go from this place proclaiming Jacob's words. Surely the Lord is in this place. Thanks, y'all.